A girl rides her bicycle down a narrow lane in the village of Aylesbeare, Devon, England, a quiet farming community 8 miles east of the city of Exeter, in the southwest of the country. It's just past 3:30 in the afternoon, on a warm Saturday in August 1978. She's 13 years old. Her name is embroidered in red thread on the shoulder of her white cotton t-shirt. Genette. She's doing a favor. This isn't even her regular paper round. She agreed to cover it for a week while the usual boy is on holiday. She's already delivered 14 newspapers. 2 of her school friends are walking just behind her, reading an article in one of the leftover papers, laughing about something. Genette pedals a little ahead of them, over the crest of a hill, and disappears around a bend in the lane. 7 minutes later, her friends catch up to that bend. Her bicycle is lying in the middle of the road. The newspapers she was carrying are scattered across the tarmac, like she dropped them mid-stride, and Genette Tate is gone. No skid marks, no blood, no sign of a struggle. Her bike isn't even damaged. It's as if she was lifted clean off the road, mid-pedal, without a single sound loud enough for 2 friends walking 60 seconds behind her to hear. Here's what we know. Over 20,000 index cards have been filled out by police in this investigation, the largest missing person search in the history of Devon and Cornwall police. Here's what we don't know. After nearly 5 decades, whether Genette Tate is alive or dead, where her body is, and, despite one of the most notorious child serial killers in British history being formally named as her suspected murderer, whether the man responsible for taking her ever actually faced a courtroom for what he did. 3 questions are going to sit with you for the rest of this video, and I want you to hold on to them. 1. How does a teenage girl vanish into thin air on a public road in under 7 minutes? 2. Why did detectives spend 38 years chasing a man who was already behind bars for murdering other children just like her, and still couldn't charge him? And 3. What happened to the eyewitness account of a mystery car, a mystery man, and a phone call confession that led police absolutely nowhere? Welcome back to AMC True Crime. I'm going to walk you through every piece of this case. The disappearance, the search, the suspects, the confessions that turned out to be lies, and the killer that police say, with near total certainty, they know did this, but never got to prove in a court of law. This is the story of Genette Tate. Before we get into the how, I want you to know who Genette actually was, because for 47 years, she has mostly existed in headlines as a case number, a mystery, a statistic. She deserves to be more than that. Genette Louise Tate was born on the 5th of May, 1965, in the town of Taunton, Somerset. She was the only child of John Tate and Sheila Tate, later Sheila Cook after she remarried. When Genette was young, her parents' marriage broke down and they separated. The family moved around a little, briefly to Cornwall, before eventually settling into a small cottage in the village of Aylesbeare in East Devon. She lived at Barton Farm Cottage with her father John, her stepmother Violet, and her stepsister Tanya. Even though her parents had separated, Genette stayed close with her mother Sheila. Regular visits, regular contact, the kind of relationship that made it very clear this wasn't a child running from anything at home. That detail matters enormously to what comes later, because one of the first things any missing persons investigator has to rule out is whether the child left voluntarily. Genette had no reason to run. Aylesbeare in 1978 was tiny. Fewer than 500 people lived there. It was the kind of place where everybody's business was everybody else's business, where a stranger's car would get noticed, where kids rode bicycles up and down country lanes without a second thought, because nothing bad ever happened there. It sat on the edge of the East Devon pebblebed heaths, what locals call Woodbury Common, an expanse of gorse, heathland, and scattered woodland that would, within days, become the single largest search zone Devon and Cornwall police had ever mobilized. Genette was, by every account, an ordinary, happy 13-year-old. She went to school. She had friends. She had a newspaper round. Well, technically she didn't. Not normally. That's the detail that's going to matter in a minute. It's worth pausing on just how safe this world felt to the people living in it. This was rural England in the late 1970s, a place where 13-year-olds were routinely trusted to ride bicycles alone, carry cash, and knock on strangers' doors to collect for a paper round, because that was simply how childhood worked. Parents let their kids roam, because roaming had never once ended in tragedy. That collective sense of safety is precisely what makes Genette's disappearance so seismic, not just for her family, but for an entire generation of British parents who watched this story unfold on the evening news and looked differently at their own children's bicycles the next morning. Genette Tate didn't just disappear. In a very real sense, a certain kind of unguarded rural childhood disappeared along with her. Let's slow down and walk through exactly what happened that Saturday afternoon, because the precision of this timeline is what makes the case so disturbing. This isn't a girl who disappeared sometime in the afternoon. We know almost the exact minute. Genette wasn't supposed to be delivering newspapers that day. The boy who normally did the round around Aylesbeare was on holiday, and Genette had agreed to cover it for the week. A small act of neighborly reliability from a 13-year-old who probably just wanted a bit of pocket money. She set out that afternoon with a bag of papers and her bicycle, following the same route the regular boy would have taken. At approximately 3:28 p.m., two of her school friends saw her walking along Withen Lane, pushing her bike beside her. They spoke briefly, the kind of passing conversation you'd expect between kids on a summer afternoon. Genette had already delivered 14 papers by this point. At the top of the hill, she got back on her bike and rode on ahead while her two friends lingered behind, reading an article in one of the leftover newspapers. That's it. That's the last confirmed sighting of Genette Tate by anyone who has ever come forward. A 13-year-old girl, on a bicycle, riding away from her friends on a quiet country road in broad daylight. I want you to actually picture the geography here, because it matters. Withen Lane isn't a busy road. It's a narrow, hedge-bordered country lane, the kind with tall banks of earth and vegetation on either side, curving gently, with limited sight lines around every bend. Genette's friends weren't far behind her. 60 seconds, maybe less, based on how quickly they reached the bend after she rode ahead. In a stretch of open road, 60 seconds of separation is nothing. You'd still be in shouting distance. You'd almost certainly still be in view for at least part of that gap. But this lane curves, and behind that curve, for a window of time that couldn't have been more than a few minutes, Genette was completely out of anyone's line of sight. 7 minutes later, her friends came around that bend and found her bicycle lying in the middle of the road. The newspapers she'd been carrying were scattered across the tarmac. No Genette. Now, if you're picturing a struggle, tire marks, a car skidding to a stop, evidence of violence, that is not what was found. And this is the detail that has haunted investigators for almost 50 years. There were no skid marks on the road. Her bicycle wasn't damaged. There was no blood. Nothing to suggest she had been struck by a vehicle, and nothing to suggest a physical struggle took place exactly where the bike was found. Police would later formally rule out a hit-and-run accident for precisely this reason. A vehicle striking a cyclist leaves evidence, tire marks, a damaged bike. This bicycle looked like it had simply been set down, or dropped, mid-motion. Approximately 25 minutes after her friends found the bike, Genette's parents returned home from a shopping trip in Exeter. The two girls were waiting with Genette's bicycle, asking if she was home yet. She wasn't. At that moment, the ordinary rhythm of a Saturday afternoon broke completely. John Tate and Sheila, along with friends and neighbors, began searching the immediate area around Withen Road themselves, checking hedgerows, calling her name, doing what any parent would do in that first wave of disbelief, before panic fully sets in. By 5 p.m., John Tate had called Devon and Cornwall police. Genette Tate was officially reported missing, and from that moment forward, nothing about this case would ever be ordinary again. What happened next is, by any measure, one of the most extensive missing person operations Britain has ever seen, and I want to walk you through the scale of it, because the sheer size of this search only deepens the mystery of how nothing was ever found. Within hours, Devon and Cornwall police mobilized 70 uniformed officers and 50 detectives. Mounted police were brought in from the neighboring Avon and Somerset force. Underwater search units checked every pond in the Aylesbeare area, because in a rural farming region like this, ponds and reservoirs are often the first place investigators look when a child goes missing near water sources. Search dogs combed the surrounding terrain. The village hall was converted into an incident room, and for the following 6 weeks, more than 80 officers systematically combed the fields and woodlands within a 5-mile radius of Aylesbeare. An RAF helicopter was deployed. Royal Marines joined the ground search, and on one single Saturday afternoon, more than 7,000 members of the public turned out to help search nearby Woodbury Common after police put out a public appeal. 7,000 people, searching gorse and heathland for a 13-year-old girl. This is, to this day, described as the biggest search operation Devon and Cornwall police have ever mounted, before or since. And they found nothing. Not a shoe, not a scrap of clothing, not a single confirmed trace of Genette Tate. Investigators worked quickly to rule out the most obvious explanations. Had she run away? No. She'd left behind money she'd been saving for a family holiday, and the coins she'd collected that afternoon from her paper-round customers were still sitting in her purse, still attached to the abandoned bicycle. A girl who runs away takes her money. A girl who runs away takes something. Genette took nothing with her except the clothes on her back, a white cotton t-shirt with her name stitched on the shoulder, light brown trousers, and white plimsoll shoes. Had she simply wandered off and gotten lost, or had an accident alone in the woods? With this scale of search, dogs, helicopters, thousands of volunteers combing every hedge and pond within 5 miles, investigators considered this vanishingly unlikely almost immediately. That left one working theory, and it's the one that would come to define the case for the next 4 decades. Someone took her. A team of 70 divisional and regional crime squad detectives mounted an intensive investigation, not just locally, but nationally, and eventually internationally. Genette's photograph and story reached almost every town in Britain through newspaper coverage, television broadcasts, radio appeals, and thousands of printed posters distributed by the police force. For a period of months, this wasn't just a regional news story. It was one of the biggest stories in the country. And in the middle of all of that publicity, one witness account emerged that would shape the entire direction of the investigation for years to come. Eyewitnesses reported seeing a maroon-colored Triumph, or a car of very similar appearance, on Within Road around the time Genette disappeared. Based on those accounts, police issued a photo-fit image of a man they urgently wanted to trace and question. The description was oddly specific for a stranger glimpsed for only a few seconds. A man in his early 20s, described by witnesses as very handsome, with a pale complexion and short dark hair, wearing a light-colored shirt. Think about that description for a second. Not menacing, not suspicious-looking, very handsome. The kind of description that, on its own, wouldn't make anyone cross the street. That's part of what makes this case so unsettling. If this man is connected to Genette's disappearance at all, he apparently didn't look like a threat to the people who saw him. He looked unremarkable enough to blend into a quiet Devon village on a Saturday afternoon. Despite the photo fit being circulated nationally, despite the maroon Triumph lead being pursued for months, police were never able to identify or locate this man with certainty. The car was never definitively traced. The lead, like so many others in this case, simply went cold. Over the following years, the investigation would generate an almost unbelievable volume of material. To this day, Devon and Cornwall police maintain more than 20,000 index cards related to this case in a filing system stored at their headquarters in Exeter, a physical monument to just how many tips, leads, statements, and dead ends this disappearance produced. And some of those leads were far stranger and far more painful for Genette's family than a photo fit of an unidentified driver. In 1990, 12 years after Genette vanished, police were handed a tape recording that seemed, for a moment, like it might finally break the case wide open. The tape contained the voice of a 32-year-old woman from Sidmouth, a town in East Devon not far from Aylesbeare. On the recording, she claimed to have been a passenger in a car that had struck and killed Genette back in 1978. According to her account, the male driver, panicking, desperate to avoid consequences, had carried Genette's body into nearby woodland and buried her there. The woman described him returning to the car afterward with bloodstains on his clothing. For a case that had gone 12 years without a single solid break, this was electric. A named accident, a body location, a motive for the cover-up. It had the shape of exactly the kind of answer Genette's family had been begging for. Police followed up immediately. They took the woman to Aylesbeare, back to the actual roads and landmarks she'd described on the tape, hoping she could physically point to the location where the body had supposedly been buried. She couldn't identify a single location she'd described, not one. And there was another problem, one that had actually been apparent to investigators from the very beginning. Remember what we told you earlier? There were no tire marks on the road, no damage to Genette's bicycle, no blood at the scene. Police had already concluded, based on physical evidence gathered in the first days of the investigation, that Genette had almost certainly not been the victim of a car accident. The physical scene simply didn't support it. So what was this tape? A confused memory? A deliberate hoax? A case of someone inserting themselves into a story that had gripped the entire country? We don't fully know. What we do know is that it led nowhere. Another dead end in a case that had already accumulated hundreds of them. In fact, according to accounts from the investigation, a local vicar once ran a 24-hour phone line for the public to call in tips and received over 600 individual confessions and claims related to Genette's disappearance. 600. From a village of fewer than 500 people in a case that had captured the entire nation's attention. That's the disorienting scale of this case. Hundreds of people calling in to claim responsibility, or claim knowledge, or claim to have seen something. And after all of it, after tens of thousands of index cards and a search involving thousands of volunteers, investigators were still no closer to knowing what actually happened to Genette in those 7 minutes on Withen Lane. But there was one name that kept surfacing. One name that, over time, would become the central, defining suspect in this entire case. A man whose crimes against other children were so calculated, so methodical, and so horrifying that when his name entered the Genette Tate investigation, everything about how police understood this case began to change. His name was Robert Black. To understand why Robert Black became the central suspect in Genette Tate's disappearance, you need to understand exactly who he was. Because this isn't a man police simply guessed at. This is a convicted, confirmed serial child killer whose pattern of crimes lines up with Genette's case in deeply disturbing ways. Robert Black was born on the 21st of April 1947 in Grangemouth, Scotland, illegitimate and given up by his mother when he was just months old. He was placed in foster care, moved between homes and institutions throughout his childhood, and by his own later admissions to psychologists, his fascination with young girls began disturbingly early, escalating through his adolescence and into adulthood. As an adult, Black became a long-distance delivery van driver, and this occupation is, chillingly, the key to how he was able to commit crimes across such an enormous geographic area without detection for so many years. Driving delivery routes across the length and breadth of Britain gave him an intimate, working knowledge of the entire road network. It gave him the ability to abduct a child in one part of the country and be hundreds of miles away, potentially in a different country entirely, before anyone even realized the child was missing. He was meticulous about avoiding identification. He would grow a beard, then shave it off. He would shave his head completely bald, then let his hair grow back. He owned more than a dozen pairs of glasses and would deliberately wear a pair that looked nothing like his usual eyewear when he was hunting for a victim. He covered the rear windows of his delivery van with opaque black curtains. Between 1981 and 1986, Robert Black abducted, sexually assaulted, and murdered at least 3 young girls: Susan Maxwell, age 11, from Northumberland; Caroline Hogg, age 5, from Edinburgh; and Sarah Harper, age 10, from Leeds. He was finally caught in July 1990, not through a breakthrough on any of his previous crimes, but because he was seen forcing a 6-year-old girl into his van in the Scottish borders. A member of the public witnessed the abduction, alerted police, and Black was intercepted with the child, who survived. In 1994, he was convicted of the murders of Maxwell, Hogg, and Harper, and sentenced to life imprisonment, with a recommendation that he serve a minimum of 35 years, a sentence that effectively meant he would die behind bars. In 2011, an additional conviction followed: the 1981 murder of 9-year-old Jennifer Carty in County Antrim, Northern Ireland. proving that Black's crimes had crossed not just county lines, but national borders, spanning the entire United Kingdom. At the time of his death, investigators believed Black may have been responsible for as many as 10 or more additional unsolved child abductions and murders across Britain, Ireland, and continental Europe, dating back to 1969. His known confirmed span of crimes runs from 1981 to 1990, but police believe his actual offending began years earlier, and Genette Tate disappeared in 1978, which puts Robert Black's suspected offending window directly over the date of her disappearance. Here's where the case against Robert Black and Genette's disappearance gets genuinely disturbing, because this wasn't just a theoretical connection based on his other crimes. There is specific, documented evidence tying him to the area. During the course of his delivery driving work throughout the 1970s, Robert Black made regular deliveries in and around the Exeter area, the same region where Aylesbeare sits. This wasn't a man with no connection to Devon. This was a man whose job routinely brought him within miles of where Genette vanished. In 1996, an eyewitness came forward, claiming to have seen a vehicle matching the model Black is known to have driven in 1978 at Exeter Airport, on the very day Genette disappeared. Investigators pursued this lead extensively, but were ultimately unable to conclusively establish that Black had actually been in Aylesbeare itself on the day of the disappearance. Being near Exeter Airport and being on Withan Lane are two different things, and police needed to prove the latter. But perhaps the most chilling piece of evidence came from an entirely different direction. Not from a car sighting, but from Robert Black himself. In the early 1990s, Black participated in a series of recorded interviews with Dr. Ray Wire, a pioneering expert in the treatment and psychological assessment of child sex offenders. During those sessions, conducted, remember, years before the internet made crime scene details easily searchable, in an era when case information was far more tightly controlled, Black disclosed extensive, specific knowledge of the precise scene and circumstances surrounding Genette's abduction. Knowledge that, according to investigators, a person with no connection to the crime would have had no way of knowing. This is the kind of detail that doesn't prove guilt in a courtroom on its own, but it is exactly the kind of detail that reshapes how seriously investigators take a suspect. When a convicted, confirmed child serial killer, with a documented, methodical pattern of abduction and a proven ability to travel the entire UK road network undetected, starts describing details of your cold case that were never made public, that is not a coincidence police can afford to ignore. But the disclosures to Dr. Wire weren't the only thing tying Black to Aylesbeare. When Devon and Cornwall detectives finally briefed John Tate in 2016, they laid out a far more granular case than the public had ever heard before. And this is where the investigation stops sounding like speculation and starts sounding like an actual, methodical piece of police work. According to what police shared with the family, Black allegedly made what's been described as a jail confession to a member of prison staff, admitting, in that conversation, that he had in fact visited Aylesbeare. On top of that admission, investigators had a specific, corroborated sighting, Black at Exeter Airport, roughly 12 miles from Aylesbeare, on the very day Genette went missing. And according to John Tate, Black was reportedly seen there, watching children, closely enough that a mother present at the time later described the behavior as odd and creepy. Detectives also reconstructed Black's movements using something almost mundane in its reliability: his petrol receipts. As a delivery driver, Black's fuel purchases were logged and traceable, and police used that paper trail to establish that he was, in fact, buying petrol to travel in and out of Devon during the relevant period, not just passing near the region once, but making a habit of it. Investigators believed they had even worked out his likely route in and out of Aylesbeare on the day itself. And there was one more detail. Small, but the kind of thing that sticks with you. Witnesses in the area recalled seeing a red van in the vicinity around the time Genette vanished. Black was known to drive exactly that kind of vehicle for his delivery work. Here's what genuinely elevates this case above a simple, "we have a hunch" theory, though. Devon and Cornwall police didn't just compare Black to Genette's case in isolation. They built a structured scoring system, cross-referencing 15 specific criteria drawn directly from the confirmed details of Black's other murders. 8 of those 15 criteria related to the circumstances of the offense itself. Things like whether the victim was a young girl, whether she was riding a bicycle at the time, the type of location, and, in a detail that is almost unbearably specific, whether the victim was wearing white ankle socks, a small but consistent detail across several of Black's known victims. The remaining 7 criteria on that list couldn't be assessed at all, because they related directly to the condition and location of the victims' bodies after death, and Genette's body has never been found. There was simply nothing to compare. Using this scoring framework, investigators worked through and eliminated more than 300 other possible suspects over the years, which is, frankly, the real explanation for why this case took so agonizingly long to build. It wasn't inaction. It was the slow, methodical process of ruling out 300 other names before the evidence against Black became compelling enough to act on. And there's one more piece of this that I think is genuinely important to understand, because it addresses the question so many viewers will already be asking. If Black is responsible, why has Genette's body never turned up when 3 of his other victims were eventually found? Investigators believe her body may lie many miles from Aylesbeare, potentially in an area some detectives have referred to as the Midlands Triangle, a region investigators believe Black used repeatedly to dispose of victims he'd abducted from entirely different parts of the country. This was, in fact, his signature method: snatch a child in one region and drive, sometimes for hours, sometimes overnight, to a completely different, disconnected area to leave the body, specifically to sever any obvious geographic link between the abduction site and the deposition site. If that pattern holds true for Genette, her remains could be anywhere across a vast stretch of the English countryside, in a location Robert Black took to his grave and never disclosed to anyone. Following his death, a police source close to the investigation put it about as plainly as it's ever been put. They had believed they were on the verge of getting Britain's worst serial killer into court over one of the country's biggest mysteries, and that a lot of officers who worked this case for years were left devastated they never got the chance to finish it. So if the evidence was building this significantly against Robert Black, why did he die in 2016 without ever being formally charged with Genette Tate's murder? This is, honestly, one of the most gutting parts of this entire story. The Crown Prosecution Service, the body responsible for deciding whether there's enough evidence to bring criminal charges in England and Wales, first reviewed the case against Black in relation to Genette back in 2008. Their decision at that time: insufficient evidence to charge him. But the investigation didn't stop there. In 2011, Robert Black was convicted of murdering 9-year-old Jennifer Carty in Northern Ireland, a case that had gone unsolved for 30 years, essentially the same length of time Genette's case had been open at that point. And investigators in Northern Ireland were struck by something specific: the striking similarities between the Carty murder and Genette's disappearance. Comments that were made publicly by a spokesperson for the police service of Northern Ireland at the time. That conviction reopened the door. Devon and Cornwall police formally reviewed the Tate case again in June 2014, specifically hoping to find sufficient real evidence, meaning physical or circumstantial evidence strong enough to actually stand up in court, to finally prosecute Black for Genette's murder. And they got close. Genuinely, agonizingly close. By January 2016, Devon and Cornwall police were reportedly just 5 weeks away from submitting a file to the Crown Prosecution Service seeking a new charging decision against Robert Black for Genette Tate's murder. 5 weeks. On the 12th of January 2016, Robert Black died in his cell at HMP Magaberry Prison in Northern Ireland. Cause of death: a heart attack. An inquest later confirmed the underlying factors: decades of heavy smoking, high blood pressure, a previous stroke, diabetes, and degeneration of his coronary arteries. A man who had evaded a full accounting for the murder of Genette Tate for 38 years died of entirely ordinary, self-inflicted health causes, 5 weeks before police believed they finally had enough to formally pursue him. The file was still submitted to the Crown Prosecution Service in April 2016, even after his death, but the CPS confirmed there would be no posthumous decision to charge a dead man. The case, from a legal standpoint, closed the only door it had ever gotten close to opening. When Robert Black died, nobody claimed his remains. His ashes were scattered at sea, without ceremony, in accordance with prison service policy for unclaimed remains, an anonymous, unmarked end for a man responsible for shattering an untold number of families. Devon and Cornwall police, however, did something they rarely do in an unsolved case. In October 2016, detectives visited Genette's father, John Tate, in person, carrying with them a 500-page dossier. In that dossier, they formally informed him that Robert Black was, in the words later reported, unquestionably responsible for Genette's kidnap and murder, not a suspect, not a person of interest. Police told her family they believed, based on the totality of their investigation, that they knew who did this. They just never got to prove it to a jury. I want to spend a moment here on John Tate, because this case is not just an intellectual puzzle. It's the story of a father who spent 38 years of his life waiting for an answer that never fully came. Even after police told him, in that 2016 meeting, that they believed Robert Black was responsible, John Tate's response wasn't triumphant certainty. It was something far more complicated. In August 2018, on the eve of the 40th anniversary of his daughter's disappearance, he made a public plea for information, and he said something extraordinarily honest. I am not even 100% sure Black did it. I need proof that Black killed her. Think about the weight in that sentence. Even after being handed a 500-page police dossier naming a specific, convicted serial killer as his daughter's murderer, John Tate, a father who had lived with this uncertainty for 4 decades, still wanted proof. Real, courtroom-tested, undeniable proof. Not a police theory, however well supported. Proof. By that point, John's health was failing. He told reporters that he could no longer make his annual pilgrimage from his home in Manchester down to Aylesbeare, a trip he had apparently made every single year since 1978, returning to the village, to the lane, to the place his daughter was last seen. His final wish, he said, was simple and devastating: to give Genette a dignified Christian burial, and to be buried alongside her. John Tate died in April 2020, at the age of 77. He never got that burial. He never got to bring his daughter home. In 2002, years earlier, DNA belonging to Genette had been recovered from a jumper her mother had kept, preserved specifically so that if her remains were ever found, at any point in the future, she could be positively identified. That DNA sample still exists today. It's still waiting. On the 25th anniversary of the case, back in 2003, both of Genette's parents publicly stated they believed she was no longer alive. It was, by that point, less a moment of new information and more an acknowledgement of a truth they had likely carried privately for years. The kind of thing you say out loud only once you've made a kind of peace, however incomplete, with never getting the alternative answer you wanted. I mentioned earlier that a local vicar's 24-hour tip line alone collected over 600 confessions and claims. Robert Black may be the name history remembers, but he was never the only theory investigators, and the public, chased over the decades. And I think it's worth walking through a few of them, because they show you just how much noise surrounds a case like this, and how difficult it is for police to find the signal underneath it. Even decades after the disappearance, new claims kept surfacing. As recently as 2017, unverified claims emerged, suggesting an unauthorized burial had taken place at St. Mary's Churchyard in Aylesbeare. That same weekend, Genette vanished. A theory serious enough that a local resident actually ran for public office on the platform of reopening attention to it, hoping the publicity of a political campaign might shake loose new information or pressure police into re-examining the churchyard. Nothing conclusive ever came from it, but the fact that this theory was still alive and driving people to run for local council nearly 40 years after the disappearance tells you something about how deeply this case has embedded itself into the identity of this small Devon community. Aylesbeare has never been able to fully move on, because Aylesbeare has never been given an ending. There was also, of course, the Maroon Triumph and its unidentified driver, a lead that ran in parallel to the Robert Black theory for years, never definitively ruled out, never definitively confirmed. Was that very handsome young man in the light-colored shirt an entirely separate individual, unconnected to Black, who happened to be in the area that same afternoon? Was he a witness who was simply never traced and never came forward? Or is it possible, and this is pure speculation on our part, because nobody has ever proven it, that this was Black himself, seen by a different witness, described differently because eyewitness memory is famously unreliable under stress? We don't know. Nobody does. And then there's the confession tape from 1990, the Sidmouth woman's account of a hit and run and a hasty burial in the woods. We already told you that police were able to rule this out fairly conclusively, both because the physical evidence never supported a vehicle collision and because the woman herself couldn't identify a single location she'd described when taken back to the scene. But it's a reminder of just how much emotional and psychological weight a case like this carries in a small community. Enough that, 12 years on, someone felt compelled to come forward with a detailed, specific, entirely false account. Whether that was a hoax, a delusion, or something else entirely, we may never know that either. So where does that leave us? Nearly 48 years after a 13-year-old girl rode her bicycle around a bend in a country lane and never came out the other side. Devon and Cornwall police officially continue to classify this as a murder investigation. It remains, formally, one of the longest-running unsolved missing person and murder inquiries in British history. Genette's case file, the 20,000-plus index cards, the decades of statements, the forensic reviews, the 500-page dossier on Robert Black, still sits at police headquarters in Exeter. Genette Louise Tate has never been found. Not her body, not her bicycle, not a single confirmed physical trace connecting anyone to that 7-minute gap on Withan Lane. As of 2026, this case remains exactly what it was in 1978, a girl who vanished delivering newspapers on a Saturday afternoon, and a country lane that has never given up its secret. Here's what we know for certain. Genette did not run away. The evidence ruled out a traffic accident almost immediately. A serial killer with a documented pattern of abducting girls along the length of the British road network had a demonstrated, verified presence in the Exeter area during the exact era she disappeared, and disclosed knowledge of the crime scene that police believe he shouldn't have had. And that same man died 5 weeks before investigators believed they finally had enough evidence to charge him. But here's what we still don't know. We don't know, with absolute certainty, whether Robert Black is truly the man who took Genette that day, or whether, as her own father wondered right up until his death, the real answer is still out there, unconnected to Black at all. We don't know what happened to the man in the maroon Triumph, the very handsome stranger with the pale complexion who was never identified. We don't know where Genette's body is. We don't know if she was taken somewhere close to Aylesbeare or transported hundreds of miles away, the way Black's other victims were. And we may never know. That's the uncomfortable, honest truth of true cold cases. Sometimes the most likely answer is also the answer nobody can ever fully prove. Before we close this out, I want to zoom out for a second and talk about the scale of what this case actually did to Britain in 1978. Because it's easy, watching this decades later on YouTube, to lose sight of just how enormous this story was in real time. Genette's photograph, that same school-style portrait that's been reused in every article about her case since, reached, by some estimates, almost every town in the country. Newspapers ran it, television bulletins ran it, radio appeals repeated her description on a loop. Thousands of printed posters went up in shop windows, on telephone poles, in post offices, from Devon all the way to Scotland. For a period of months in late 1978, "Have you seen Genette Tate?" was a sentence most of the country could recite. This was, in many ways, one of the first missing child cases in modern British history to receive that level of sustained, nationwide media saturation. A media playbook that would later become depressingly familiar with subsequent high-profile missing child cases in the decades that followed. Aylesbeare, a village of fewer than 500 people that most of the country had never heard of, became a place everyone in Britain could suddenly picture. A quiet lane, a fallen bicycle, scattered newspapers, and 47 years later, we're still picturing it. I don't want to close this video on Robert Black. I don't want the last image you take away from this story to be a serial killer's name. I want it to be Genette's. She was 13. She had friends she talked to on the walk home. She was saving money for a family holiday she never got to take. She agreed to cover someone else's paper round for a week. Because that's the kind of ordinary, generous thing a 13-year-old does without thinking twice about it. She should have had 47 more birthdays by now. She should be 61 years old this year, somewhere, living a life none of us will ever get to know anything about. Instead, her name is a case file, a dossier, a cold case podcast, a video like this one. So here's what I want to ask you. Honestly, if you were one of the two friends walking behind Genette that afternoon, if you were 60 seconds behind her, close enough to have spoken to her minutes before, but not close enough to see what happened around that bend, what do you think you'd remember, all these decades later? And more importantly, do you think justice is even possible in a case like this anymore? Or is the most honest outcome we can hope for simply finding her and bringing her home? I want to know what you think happened in those 7 minutes. Put it in the comments below. I read every single one, and on a case this old, sometimes it really is a viewer with a memory, a family story, or a piece of local history that ends up mattering. If this is the first AMC true crime video you've watched, we cover unsolved cases just like this one every week. Cases that mainstream true crime often skips past. Cases that deserve to stay in front of people until they're finally solved. Subscribe, turn on notifications, because the moment there is ever a new development in the Genette Tate case, and after 47 years, developments do still happen, you will be the first to know. And if you found this case as unsettling as I did putting it together, you're going to want to see the ones we've covered like it. Cases where police say they know who did it, and still couldn't close the file. Those videos are linked right on screen now, and in the description below. Genette Tate disappeared on a quiet lane in a quiet English village, and 47 years later, we're still trying to bring her home. Thank you for watching, and for remembering her name.